For bodybuilding and athletic performance, constructing a diet is actually rather simple. We begin with the macronutrients, carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. Generally speaking, you want to consume 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight. This level of protein consumption will allow you to build muscle and generally keep you full without making you feel overly stuffed. Now, of course, protein intake can vary. I personally like to eat a little bit more protein because I tend to struggle with satiety, and some people need less protein, but this is a good place to start. Next, we move on to fats. Dietary fats are actually not particularly integral to performance. Perhaps if you're a long-distance endurance athlete, this becomes more relevant, but generally speaking, you need very little dietary fat to regulate hormones and feel good. So, if possible, I like to keep fats very low. I'm talking about an intake of about 0.3 to 0.5 grams per pound of body weight. This can vary by individual, but generally speaking, fats serve little purpose when it comes to athletic performance. Additionally, you really want to try to keep your saturated fats low, as saturated fats are just destructive, they only raise your LDL, and they have no performance benefit. This is particularly relevant to enhanced athletes who may already have elevated lipids. Lastly, we come to carbs. Proteins and fats tend to stay constant regardless of whether or not you're maintaining, gaining, or trying to lose weight, whereas carbs tend to shift up or down depending on our performance and body composition goals. So, if you're seeking to lose weight, you drop carbs, and if you're seeking to gain weight, you should increase carbs. They're the lever that we most typically push, and that's because carbohydrates are the preferred fuel source for the body. Now, of course, there is some nuance here. So, for example, when you're deep into a diet and your carbs are quite low, you might want to increase your proteins, because carbohydrates are muscle sparing, and proteins also tend to make people feel more full. Conversely, if you're trying to gain a lot of weight and you're well above your maintenance calories, you might reduce your protein, as that will help you to consume more food, and again, those carbohydrates are muscle sparing. So we've established that we should work with macros, but how do we track this? Well, if you're new to this is relatively easy. You can use a macro tracking app and record all the foods that you eat. This will enable you to see in real time how much proteins, fats, and carbs you're consuming. Now, there's 2 ways to do this conceptually. You can use an app and track everything and write down those macros as is. Alternatively, you can ignore trace macros. So what I mean by that is when you're eating lean meats, you can ignore the fats, and when you're eating carbohydrates, you can ignore the accompanying proteins. This system works fine, you just have to be consistent. I will say that the latter system, where you're ignoring some of the macros, can tend to break down at the extremes at very low caloric intakes and very high caloric intakes, but generally speaking, for most people, both systems work great. Once we've established our macros, how do we choose foods? This, in and of itself, is also not that complicated. We want to get our proteins from lean protein sources. Think chicken, turkey, low-fat beef, and egg whites. These should be your staples. Carbohydrates should generally be easy to digest. If you're eating a lot, that probably means white rice. If you're eating less, that means more potatoes and oatmeal. Because we're seeking to keep saturated fats low, we should get most of our dietary fats from nuts, seeds, fatty fish, and avocado. When you're trying to gain weight, you may eat more lower volume processed foods, and when you're trying to lose weight, you probably want higher volume foods just to keep yourself full. Okay, so how often should we eat? Thankfully, meal frequency doesn't really matter. Studies have shown that your protein intake over the day matters far more than your protein intake per meal. So as long as you're getting in those macros over the course of the day, you should be fine. The other thing I tend to see with myself and clients is that eating smaller, more frequent meals tends to drive hunger up. So if you're deep into a diet, you might actually want to have fewer, larger meals, but if you're trying to gain weight, you may want smaller, more frequent meals. If and when possible, you should seek to consume the majority of your carbohydrates around exercise, as that has been shown to improve body composition and nutrient partitioning. However, this detail is relatively minor, and again, the key is getting in those calories over the course of the day. Now, of course, you don't need to be overly neurotic about any of this. You can have off-plan meals. I think having a meal with your partner or friend is probably going to be better for your performance and athletic recovery than sitting at home and eating out of Tupperware. Bodybuilding should complement your life and not dominate it. That being said, one of the best ways to adhere to a diet, whether or not you're gaining, maintaining, or losing, is to roughly eat the same kinds of meals every day. Again, I'm not saying you have to have the exact same dishes day after day after day, but if you can simplify those choices, it makes adherence, shopping, and just consistency so much easier. Lastly, if you can, take a 10-minute walk after all of your meals. This has been shown to improve digestion and helps to maintain insulin sensitivity. And studies have shown that taking frequent walks after meals is actually better for body composition than taking a longer walk in the middle of the day. So, if possible, take a walk after each meal. Again, you may be taking 3, 4, 5 walks a day. These don't need to be very long, but it'll help you with digestion and improve body composition in the long run. You'll notice I just used the phrase insulin sensitivity. What does that mean? Insulin sensitivity refers to your body's ability to properly partition nutrients, to place the calories you consume in the relevant tissues. So if your insulin sensitivity is high, that means it's more likely that your body will partition those nutrients to muscle and not to fat. Conversely, if you have insulin resistance, your body is going to be more inclined to place those calories within fat tissues, which in turn, over time, will worsen your insulin resistance, creating a terrible negative feedback loop. Now, of course, this doesn't matter for most athletes. Most athletes are relatively lean, small, and active. However, if you're a bodybuilder or a powerlifter or strongman really pursuing the heights of athletic excellence, you're probably going to be driving your body weight up pretty hard, and this in turn could cause insulin resistance over time. So let's go over a few strategies you can implement to mitigate that. The most common dietary tactic that bodybuilders implement is something called carb cycling. So within a week, they'll have a day in which they consume higher carbs, lower carbs, and a medium amount of carbs. This cycling of carbs, this undulating consumption of carbs, gives the body a break. It allows you periods in which theoretically you can regain some degree of insulin sensitivity. If you're someone who struggles with digestion, it can also help to have low-calorie days. It gives your gut and your body a break. You can take carb cycling a step further and implement intermittent fasting, which would mean that you have periods in the day or even the week in which you don't consume food. This can be effective for promoting insulin sensitivity and satiety. Its effects tend to be most dramatic when your fasting periods are elongated. However, if your fasting periods get too long, that can also negatively impact muscle growth. So there is a balance there. Lastly, in the realm of enhanced bodybuilding, there are medical interventions that can and are used to help promote insulin sensitivity. Metformin, which is a drug used to treat diabetics, is typically the first line of defense for the large bodybuilder. There is an over-the-counter equivalent known as berberine, which can be purchased freely online. It's not quite as effective as metformin, but it can be obtained legally without a prescription, and it doesn't cause some of the digestive issues that metformin is known for. Lastly, of course, if you're truly a gigantic enhanced bodybuilder, you might also be leveraging insulin for performance reasons, but I won't get into that here. So I said at the top that constructing a diet for performance was simple, but then I went on and listed 10 different things that you have to control and maximize. I'll say that each of these variables in and of itself is not that complicated, but of course this balancing act does require a lot of thought and planning. Don't try to change everything all at once. Take each variable, try to improve it, and over time you'll be able to maximize performance and body composition.